Oh, hi, Michel. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. I'm trying to find where I put the. Yeah, I got it. The window. I got it. Yeah. Hey.
Okay. We have the Crypto Commons crowd here. Okay. Okay. I'll keep up the video. Okay. Now we are giving you a short introduction, and then we are leaving you in the presentation. Cool.
All right.
Okay, so I was asked what you get interested in. So kind of so this I mean really context way you guys we have a strong connection. Let's roll with it. So Michel Bauwens is Belgian peer-to-peer Belgium and theorist and an active writer, researcher, subject of technology, culture, business. Michel Bauwens, the theorist, emerging theory and director and founder of the Foundation, global organization, research, working all these things. Production governance, property, he has authored a number of essays, including his thesis, The Political Economy of Action. To you, Michel.
Please, Michel, you can go. Thank you.
All right. Yes. So a big sorry that we misunderstood the timing. I was ready for in an hour, actually 9:30 Thai time. So I was very relaxed, and now I'm very stressed because of the change. All right. So I'm counting around 40 minutes. You tell me if that's too long but that's kind of what I planned. All right. So what I want to do is to kind of sketch a bit of a historical view of the commons, and then to kind of ask the question, where are we now? And, where are we going? So this is about so I will end with the present conjuncture and what I believe that the commons movement is doing and maybe even should be doing. So the first thing, very briefly, when I started doing my work, that was way back in 2003, 2004, when I took a sabbatical to study historical transitions. I discovered an author called Alan Page Fisk, who divides human exchange in four ways. Communal shareholding, which is when you have a common resource that is useful for everyone. The gift economy, which he called equality matching, when you give something and you create kind of a need for other people to give back. The market and redistribution through the state. So these were the four modes of exchange that he saw. And then there's another author called Kojin Karatani, which has kind of historicized them. And the basic idea is that there's always one of these forms which dominates. And the others don't disappear, but they're kind of subsumed under the dominant modality. And so in that sense, we would say that the commons was the very first modality for human life, for the longest periods of time, when tribes, small bands roamed the earth. They did it for the community. The hunter it wasn't for him, it was for the family, etc., etc. And then when the tribal system starts to get more sedentary, you get tribal federations, and the gift economy becomes dominant because you can no longer avoid conflict by moving around. You have to deal with your neighbors, and the gift is a way that you pacify social relationships. And then, of course, at some point, we get conquest. And once you have conquest that doesn't work anymore, then you need redistribution, because any system of domination needs some legitimacy, and it gets that by redistributing, creating security, etc., etc. And the markets are actually the last one. So the commons has continued to exist, and I just want to give you an example. In the Middle Ages, the European Catholic Middle Ages in Western Europe, the primary, or at least as important as Easter and Christmas, was called the Rogentide procession. And this was when the whole parish would go around the frontier of the village and confirm their commons together. And, it's, in English, it's called beating the bounds, because they would make sure that these milestones were in the right place to confirm their common property. So that was a very, very important identity marker in the Middle Ages that shows the centrality of the commons, even in a feudal, hierarchical society. And then, of course, with capitalism, we get the most difficult period for the commons, because the very idea of the system is that private property works better than common property. So this is the big period of enclosures, and that's where really the material commons start kind of disappearing from Western history and from Western consciousness. While in the global South, they continue to exist much more massively, but also, unfortunately, within a dominant ideology which saw them as backward compared to the need for development and industrial development, etc. So I make a little stylized history of the commons. It's very short. So the commons start as being the primary way to preserve material resources. So they're material commons, forests, rivers. After the enclosures, we get social commons, right? So if you look at the labor movement, what's important there is that if you cannot share physical resources and your life is very insecure because there's no welfare state in the beginning, then what you do is socialize the risk, you mutualize the risk. And so they created the social commons that became the basis of our welfare state. So you could say in some way that the material commons became privatized under private property, and the social commons became statified under the welfare state regimes. And then we have the internet, and I think that creates a new phase in the history of the commons, because suddenly we create this massive amount of many-to-many communication. People start to self-organize around common projects, and they discover again that it's this capacity of working together outside of the other modalities of competition and direction by the state. So this gives a whole new life to the commons. People become aware again of the commons. And then I would say the last phase starts for me in 2008. So the previous one starts in 93 with the democratization of the digital commons. And the last stage, which I call the cosmolocal stage, starts when, because the crisis of 2008, the massive amount of youth unemployment, etc., we see a tenfold increase in physical commons again, mostly urban commons, from 2008 onwards. So I did this study in Ghent, as some of you may know. We counted 50 in 2008, and we counted 500 of these projects in 2016 when we stopped that study. So this is where we are. So we are at the level of a rephysicalization of the commons, looking at production. And so what most of you are doing is probably digital production, but we'll come back to how that is kind of so important for the physical production as well. Okay, so let me introduce another idea, which I call the pulsation of the commons. So as I said, the commons never disappear. And I think it's best to see the markets and states as extractive institutions. They're geared towards growth and dominance and power. So if you have a market, you want more profit and revenue. If you're in the state, you want eventually more territory. So the result of this is that the state and the market forms tend to deplete resources. So if you look at the history of empires and civilizations, an empire lasts usually not more than 200-300 years. What you can see is at the end they have to change capitals, they get overrun by other people, etc., etc. And this is because they have kind of exhausted their core territory. And so within that history of empires and kingdoms, some schools of research, let me mention a few: biophysical economics, so the people who look at the thermodynamic basis, the physical basis of the economy; Peter Turchin and cryodynamics, who looks at cycles. So these kinds of schools of research have noticed this kind of ebb and flow of the commons. So you have an extractive period where the empire grows and consolidates. Then you have a moment of crisis, where there is an overuse of resources, and that creates popular reactions. And there's a really fantastic book about it that I recommend to everyone. It's called Ecological Revolutions and the Axial Religions by Mark Whittaker, where he describes this in ancient China, in medieval Japan, and in post-Roman Europe. And so each time these pulsations between extractive periods and usually at that time religious spiritual revolts, where new spiritual systems combine with the people and create pressure to reorganize the society and to reinforce the commons. So just to give you maybe one idea, which I found interesting in this book. So in about 1600 in Japan, the country has 100-year civil war, but within that civil war, there is a very rich, very powerful social movement, which is called Pure Land Buddhism. And it has about 1/3 of the country organized as commons. And this, even their constitutions that have been found are very close to what Ostrom kind of studied to show that these were real commons with all the principles, the 8 principles of the commons. And then what happens is that the shogun wins the 100-year civil war, disarms the people, and basically destroys the Pure Land Buddhism concept. But he actually kind of puts them in the hand of the imperial state. History is complex and complicated, but here's the thing: by considering this land as a commons for the country, even though it was an authoritarian government run by the military, Japan knew a 200-year period with a fixed population and a fixed level of production. So in other words, for 200 years, they lived within the regional planetary boundaries of the country. And I think this is very interesting, because this is, of course, what we have now. So now I switch maybe to the situation today. So this pulsation of the commons, which has taken place in every civilization on every continent, has reached the level where the whole planet is within, an extractive push. And in other words, there's nowhere to go. There's no other people who can take over the states. There's no other territories where we can grow. And so really what that means in the present conjuncture is really that the commons has become the topic for the globe. This is where we're at, right? And this coincides with the internet network revolution. So here's the way I see the difficulty. We have now a world which is based on territories and nation states. And these nation states have been declining in power. So within the capitalist system, we have grown global networks of financial streams, of knowledge streams, that kind of really weaken the nation state territories. And at the same time, we have also created, what you are doing, which is an exponential growth of virtual communities. We could call them virtual nomadic tribes, not necessarily because they move all the time, but because they are not bound to a particular physical territory. And so this is the context that we have today. And so what reactions we have today is what creates many of the issues. First of all, I think you noticed that the nation state is having a revival. So we have countries like Hungary, Poland, Denmark, which have made a switch to a focus on re-strengthening the nation state against globalization. They can use it, they adapt to it, but at the same time, they are having a very fundamental shift towards re-strengthening the nation state. And the big question, of course, is that a realistic strategy? The second big reaction to it is what I would call the Davos Forum, right? And I'm not a believer in conspiracy theories, but what Davos represents is I would call it the enlightened elites. And basically what they want is a global governance based on public-private partnerships, but at a global level. So if you look at the Global Redesign Initiative, which was before the Global Reset, they created hundreds of workshops for in every sector of activity at a world scale. There would be kind of networks and councils, but basically they are corporate councils, and they consider the global NGOs as their advisors. But this is clearly not a democratic form, right? And I think this is where we need a third vision. The third vision that I propose is that of a cosmolocal world. And so the basic idea of a cosmolocal world is that, and we need to do this because of the planetary boundaries and the thermodynamic limits of our world, is to substantially relocalize physical production much closer to the place of physical need. I think the statistics are that we spend 3 times more resources, not money, but resources today on transporting stuff than on actually making stuff, right? So you can immediately see that a relocalization would dramatically diminish the footprint. And mutualization itself is also a technique to lower the footprint. And any production that you mutualize, and I'm not saying, like hyper collective institutions where the individual doesn't play any role. I'm thinking, for example, community agriculture, where you have a group of individuals at the consuming level making deals with a group of producers. And so it's still a market in the sense that they pay for the good, but they have created a mutually beneficial infrastructure that works for both consumers and producers. And a good example of the shift that we are going through today is a Dutch example. It's called herenboeren.nl. And basically, it's a very ambitious group. And these consumers want to have in their property 64,000 hectares of land in the Netherlands, which they would then give in an ecological contract to the farmers to get organic food. Everything that you mutualize in this way, so there is this group that John Takara talked to me about. It's called Factor 20 Reduction. And maybe some of you remember Factor 4 Reduction, which is a book that came out in the 70s. But basically, this is systematically attempting to reduce the energy footprint of any provisioning system to 5% of what is using today, but while maintaining the level of service. So the same amount of food is available, but at a much lower infrastructural cost. And what I've been working on with a friend is this idea of magisteria of the commons, because here's the issue: the global covenants can be returned to competitive nation states, can be like oligarchic management, like what the WEF is producing, but it's also could be, and this is, I think what is interesting for crypto commons is the creation of global magisteria of the commons. And I consider our report of last year called P2P Accounting for Planet Survival to be kind of preparation for, you know, envisaging this way of looking at the world. And so what is a magisteria? It's a set of interlocking institutions which set the boundaries for a certain domain. And we have that for culture, we have that for politics, we have that for different things, but we don't have institutions today which protect the basically the state of a resource and the communities using the resource, right? So this is what we mean by magisteria of the commons. So trying to imagine and build and construct global institutions that can protect a particular resource so that it stays within its planetary boundaries. Now, I mentioned the tension between territory and virtual. I think this is a big one. The other one I want to mention that is also a big one is that I think we have an increasing social split between the educated urban population and the less educated working population. And this is very much, I think, what drives politics today, and is a very complicating factor. And so here what I would caution is the idea that some of us have that we can escape the world, right? If we only create good networks, then of course we can kind of escape from this kind of disintegration of the political world and the disintegration of the economic world. And I would really caution that as virtual as we may think we are always also dependent on territory, and I think that's a very important. So I don't think we can kind of isolate ourselves as a digital class from the the misery that we are facing in the physical world. And sometimes I was reading Alexander Barth, for example, which I find very interesting, but his notion of the consumptariat as this kind of lost class of people that is just there to watch Netflix is something I feel very uncomfortable with, because I don't think such a system would have any legitimacy. So what is you see in P2P accounting for planetary survival is kind of a description of 3 new forms of accounting that are being developed by people such as you, which is contributive accounting systems which recognize non-market contributions, which is creating flow accounting systems where you're not a private entity, but you can see the whole network and see your place of the transaction in a whole network. And then thermodynamic accounting, which is basically the ability to see matter-energy flows in real time. So this is the kind of thing I think is very important, because that will create a global cyber physical infrastructure. Now, my next project, I'm still looking for funding for this, is to continue on that work and look at what is the best synthesis and cooperation between the 3 modes of exchange that we have today that are working at scale. And of course, one is from the commons, which is STIGmergy, global coordination through signaling. The second is the market. Can we imagine generative markets, so markets that don't destroy the environment and don't weaken communities, that work for commoners? And the third one is actually the state. And so imagine what this could be. And when I say state, I don't mean necessarily the state as we know today, but I mean institutions which are not just agreements between individual of groups, but kind of manage some kind of totality, and that could be a territory. And for example, if we would have a thermodynamic accounting that would very clearly inform people about planetary boundaries and could manage that, this would actually be the limit, right? That we could not produce through the destruction of the planet. That for me is some kind of planning function that we could integrate in our technology. Okay, what can I maybe I want to say one more thing, and that is about solidarity in networks. I think if we learned something for the last 10, 15 years, is that networks are very good at mobilizing a lot of people rapidly. But they're not very good at building institutions so far and in maintaining, some political and social strength. This is something the labor movement had. The labor movement had unions, fraternities, all kinds of institutions which meant material solidarity. And so this is a point I would stress for the crypto commons, which I think there's a very strong notion of being fair and equal, and like in quadratic funding and all of that. I think this is all very, very interesting for people who contribute. But what about the people who may not be contribute because they're ill? And so this is what guilds did in the Middle Ages. Is building, because they were farmers that fled or were expelled from the rural countryside, came to the cities, which were very undeveloped in the early part of the Middle Ages, and they just decided to create these fraternities that meant real solidarity. And so this, I think, something that we need to work on. I've never read the book by Max Borders about this, but this is a kind of direction I think that you should be thinking of. And also I think that some kind of reflection of the role of the nation state is important. Whatever happens, we will always need territorial management. So if the nation state weakens, maybe we'll have bioregional organizational forms, but we'll have territorial forms. And so one of the ideas that I was thinking about was that, okay, under neoliberalism, the role of the nation state became to a great degree to attract global capital. Because the one thing that was clear under neoliberalism is that there was one thing worse than being exploited by the multinationals, and that was not being exploited by the multinationals. So in the context of the push for development, there was this kind of competition to get investment from the global stage. And so I see something similar as a role of what I call the partner state, is to, on the one hand, stimulate local and cosmolocal cooperation, so as a new role for the territorial entities, and as a potential capacity to attract the knowledge networks and the global cooperation to benefit also the territory that they're managing. I want to give you an example, and maybe I'll close with this. Maybe I wasn't very long in my presentation. But that was the idea that I've seen in France, which I think is very, very interesting. So they're working, it's called the Banque des Territoires. It's the state bank for the regions. And they're working very seriously on a development strategy, regional development strategy that starts from the maker spaces. And the reason I like maker spaces is because the kinds of individuals we find in maker spaces are people who at the same time have knowledge, design their work, code their work, make things, and reflect on their work. So in other words, what I see in the makers is a bit of this potential human being that is no longer in the Cartesian split between mind and body, but is actually like a thinking worker. And I think that is very important that we move in that direction. So cosmolocal production for me is also about that. It's about people who are rooted. So you could say have your feet in the mud, like in permaculture. Have your heart in the community, and that is partly in the physical community and partly in the virtual community. And then, of course, you have your brain in the networks. And so at any point in the planet, you can benefit from the collective experience of the people in the networks. Well, I think that is a bit what I wanted to say. Now I go back to the tab where I have your window, because I wasn't looking at you, but looking at my notes. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening. And if you have time, I don't mind staying another 15 minutes for any questions or discussion.
Thank you. We can have some questions. Okay. We have one question.
And if you can talk slowly, because there's kind of an echo in the sound. It's not always easy for me to. Hello. Hello, Matthew.
Happy to be recognised. I'm being given a chair here. I'm not sure if it will help.
I'm not hearing anything, by the way, for the moment.
That's all. Stood here. Can you hear me now, Michel?
I can hear you, Matthew. Yeah.
Okay. Repeat. I've been around for a while. I've talked and met with a lot of imaginative, creative people working on monetary systems and social systems. But what I haven't seen in the decade or so is the uptake of these systems being imagined and built by people like me. What I see is in the world, projects such as the projects that you highlight, really very occasional ones, doing it for themselves and not consulting the expert class, such as the people in this room. And that makes a lot of us, it makes me feel irrelevant. What would you say to us when we're trying to connect between the imaginers and builders of the infrastructure and the people who are actually producing things and working out their own ways to do stuff? Is that a clear question?
It's a clear question, and I'm not sure I have a clear answer to this. Okay, so what I see, and what I could see in Ghent, is that the projects are very focused on their own thing. So you have people working on monetary reform, and they're doing monetary reform. You have people working on getting access to organic food, and they're working on organic food. They have people working on energy cooperatives, renewable energy cooperatives, and even in a city like Ghent, the permaculture of East Ghent was not talking to the permaculture of West Ghent, but at the same time they were connected to the global learning environment around permaculture, and so that very often the pioneers like you are not the ones who profit from kind of longer term evolution, but I do see an evolution, Matthew, because these people are actually slowly but surely creating international linkages and occasionally institutions. So like the renewable energy co-ops are now very well organized in Europe. Not globally, but at least in Europe. And the same thing for the farmers involved in community agriculture. So I'm in the same position as you. I advocated things like the Assembly of the Commons, the Chamber of the Commons, and to be honest, there's not much that was done on those. So I think that people like us because we are intellectual to a certain degree, and we have like this global vision. We just kind of not operating at the same level, right? And that's an enduring difficulty. Now, you might want to talk to the people present in the meeting, because I think somehow that the crypto commons is actually one of the few communities where people are actually making a living, and also that has permitted them to be there for the long term. So what I'm waiting for is maybe the same as you, is this kind of convergence between the local initiatives and that kind of cosmic level, global level. That is not happened yet. And what I said in my presentation is, where's the solidarity in the network? That's a huge problem, right? So a lot of these, like in Chiang Mai, before the COVID situation changed everything, we had up to 25,000 digital nomads here. Most of them lose their connection to the nation state, so they get forcibly removed from their registry, and they have no insurance, for example, right? And that was the case for me, and for many years. And so I think this is really one of the issues that I would like to see addressed by the crypto communities is, real solidarity, like a DAO for economic solidarity. That is something that I would like to see. Yes, sorry that I didn't respond directly to your question, is because I find it hard to answer it, basically.
Well, your difficulty with the answer confirms to me the excellence of the question.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So my question is actually about knowledge commons, and you evoked a term in your talk, the cyber physical, which happens to be like my area of background and like PhD work, etc. And my observation has been that the knowledge associated with large-scale infrastructure systems, especially information infrastructures, is deeply entangled in like extant institutions. So like the knowledge about how to design, maintain those infrastructures, and the institutions that like maintain them is so deep, like decades old work. But because it lives in states or even specific institutions within states, and the fields of engineering responsible for it are slow and heavy and require a lot of education, very difficult to turn it into a knowledge commons. And so like personally, I'm like find this challenging, and I'm trying to find ways to bridge between my like professional associations that I learned in IEEE societies and such, and an open source community. And because of the time scale differences and how much you have to learn to practice, and the scale with which we're discussing these large institutions that you've sort of articulated very clearly in your talk, I'm actually very curious if you have insights about how to better unlock the knowledge commons, or to turn captured knowledge into knowledge commons, in order to make it possible to do this in a peer productive way. Because again, to my experience, I got it through 4 engineering degrees at 2 Ivy League schools, and I don't want it to be the case that I have to, like, I shouldn't send people through that to learn the things that they need to learn to participate in designing, maintaining infrastructures and institutions. So like, how do we, or do you have any insights on how we might further unlock those knowledge commons?
Well, I don't know if you will like my answer, but I've been discussing this issue, which I discovered already in 2014 in Ecuador. I'll briefly explain to you what it is about, because it's typical. So in Ecuador at the time, you only had like 50 PhDs, but and they had maybe a few hundred officially educated computer scientists. So they had a very advanced free software regulation. which was kind of seen as a model for the world, but they couldn't apply it. And the reason they couldn't apply it was that if you were an educated computer engineer, you would either leave the country and work for an American company and earn 4 times more than in the country, or you would be hired by the government, but the government could only hire you if you had a degree. At the same time, there were thousands of unrecognized coders that actually could code, right? And what I was proposing at the time, and it wasn't accepted, but I'm still talking about this to some other people in the educational world, is to find institutions that are willing to be the bridge, basically, right? So now we have 2 worlds: the formal education and the informal education. And the informal world is trying to work with open accreditation and open badges. And I haven't followed closely enough to know how that is going. But I think we need bridge institutions. And the bridge institutions would be to find some kind of agreement with a recognized university that is willing to recognize informal learning. Does that make sense?
It does. It's both consonant and dissonant with what I've experienced, in the sense that the extra barriers imposed by basically the cost of maintaining the relationship with the institutions and the emphasis on what essentially are formal credentials actually diminishes the rate of knowledge production, which, at least for me,
Right.
I've observed happening in the open source communities, as long as the norms and values exist to allow people to teach and learn and respect expertise. And so I actually see a growing class of people with the skills, with the informal education, as long as they're willing to sort of undertake the time and effort to grow the expertise. So it's really important to manage the difference between the official credential or the credential at all from the actual skill. And so at least I've seen the opposite, where the people who are driving in the open source world are actually the ones who are foregoing the need for the credential, but without foregoing the need for the expertise. And at least my hope is actually some of the organizations in this group have been, pushing some of this more apprenticeship-based, open source oriented skill building. But I think, to your point, eventually we're going to need some sort of credentialing, even if it's not from the extant institutions, in order to signal or represent the labor that went to produce the expertise, so that we can build up stack.
Yeah, I'm on your side on this. I think one of the issues that we have with extreme horizontalism is this lack of willingness to recognize expertise. And so I think we need intermediary solutions and approaches. So one of my ideas that I see it still being tried by other people with slightly different names. But one of the things that I proposed years ago was reciprocity-based licensing. And the idea here was to have the open source world, where you have, because it's open to everyone. So you have these big companies dominating the open source economies. And then you have, private copyright. And so CopyFair was meant to be in between, where you have the knowledge is free, but if you want to have a profit, you need to participate, with recognized contributions or payment to that commons. And my idea then was that, that would be a solution for cooperatives, for example, because cooperatives who invest a lot in machinery and everything, they're very distrustful of open source around machinery, because they think big capitalist firms will then take it away and profit from it. So this is kind of an intermediate thinking where, you have these 2 kind of polarities, and you try to find, some kind of hacks that take elements of both systems and see if that kind of works. And that might be necessary to find those solutions.
Yeah, I appreciate your input. I think it's going to be something we're going to keep having to experiment with. And I see progress. It's just, I appreciate the insights, because especially to your point about not disconnecting the digital from the physical, a lot of the challenges in reasoning about things all the way from their physical instantiations that underpin the digital things that we interact with, like we can't disconnect from them. And in order to manage that, we need people who are like, working through these like complex multi-layer systems. The cyber physical systems world has actually worked very hard on that. It's just largely in service of extant institutions. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Michel.
Hello, Sarah. That's good to see you.
Likewise. So now I'm a business professor and I'm teaching Business 101 to incoming freshmen their very first semester at the university. And I don't have a lot of good material to use. My business textbook, chapter 1, what is society? What is the corporation? And you can imagine what the book says the answers are, right? And also business schools have tremendous funding. So they take the students on trips and students are always coming to me like, I want to do good for the world. What should I do? Right, kind of things. So it would be great if I had Business 101, creating the commons textbook out there. And I know I've told you this before. And also some sort of program whereby students from universities, business school students, right, who want to do this kind of movement work anyway, they just don't know it yet, go and visit these projects around the world. And so they kind of internalize this right away, their very first semester, right, and then take it on for the next 20 years.
Well, I don't have the textbook for you, but we have lots of sections in the wiki which have many examples and these are things you could visit, like Cocoon and Curto Café and Furadoeixo in Brazil. And they still exist. Some of them are doing really well. So let me give you just an example. So, Curto Café was this group of people who decided to produce coffee. So they decided to make everything transparent, so who's making the coffee. Then they made a machine so that the farmers can roast their own coffee, and they quadruple the income of the farmers already. Then they created the Coffee Commons, recipe commons. And then they did crowdfunded retail expansion. So their community funds the rent in their cafes, and in return they get free coffee. And when I visited them, a long time ago, this probably was 10, 12 years ago, it was just like one tiny little, coffee shop in a mall, and they had a poster explaining why the coffee costs what it costs, but people could pay what they want, and they would buy how you call it, like a jeton in French, you know what I mean? Anyway, and so then I went back, and they have hangars now, meaning like, huge places, like an abandoned factory, and they were dabbling in cheese and chocolate to do the same system. So I'm just saying, there are things out there that actually work. There's many things that don't work and things that disappear, but there's also a few things that actually after 10 years, they're still there. They seem to be doing well, and they're functioning in an entirely other way than a corporation. And so for students to see that, that would be fantastic. So if you want to organize a trip like that, maybe we should talk separately, and we can look at some of these examples.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So it looks so good to see you there. Maybe a last one? If there's no obligation, of course.
Yeah. it's a very fast question. Hi, Michel. Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking that, as you mentioned, in some way, we have quite a Western perspective on things and on commons. And so, what's about the effort in developing and mapping commons initiatives in the Southeast or Africa or South America? Do you know of any relevant projects to mention or some researcher to mention?
Well, it's a bit of a paradox, but where I live, I don't do this work because I used to travel the world, and so when I came home, I just with my family, and so Southeast Asia I have not covered, but I have traveled to South Africa but mostly to South America. So I have a section in my wiki called post-corporate forms, and it has something like Fura do Eixo. I don't know if you heard about it. And they're a bit controversial in Brazil, but I think they're very interesting because they were a group of young people, and they saw that the musicians were not making a living. So they started by mutualizing space so that the musicians could, have a studio and do their music. And 10 years later, they had 300 communities, 15 communes, and they had a system with 4 different monetary systems on a card. They had a university, they had a media arm, and they had like a degrowth political initiatives. So these things exist, and I try to keep track of them. It's a bit more difficult in the global South, but there's a lot of stuff happening, like around maker spaces in Africa, and these types of networks in Latin America. I think Asia is a bit more traditional. So you have to see where the countries are in psychologically, and people in East Asia for the moment, they still very much believe in capitalist development. So their attention is on trying to be in the middle class and all kinds of things. So that's, I think, a bit less than in other continents, because it was going pretty well for these countries for a number of years. COVID may change it, but because there's a lot of misery now around COVID in a lot of countries. But yeah, so I keep databases. So if you're interested, let me know, and I can kind of maybe guide you and see what I have.
Cool. Thank you. So thank you very much. You can follow the other activities to streaming. And
Yes.
Yeah, let's start with Bauwens. Hello.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good
Okay.
day.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye to everyone.